All right, welcome to the review video for your midterm exam, which will be happening this Thursday. And I trust that you have been studying already, and hopefully this review video will help you out somewhat. All right, I'm going to first go over what kind of questions you'll see on the test, and then we'll go over the review. The first section is going to be a matching section. And think about all of those different people that started different cults or different isms or different theories, all right? We talked about quite a bit of them. You want to make sure that you know the different things that they founded or different things that they started. Then there is a multiple choice section, several of those. There is a short answer section on the test. There is a true and false section, and then another short answer section, and then another true and false section. All right. Finally, there are 2 essay questions on the test, and I will say that the essay questions are 20 points apiece. So if you think about it, 40% of this test involves 2 essay questions. So you need to think through what are things that we covered quite in detail and discussed very thoroughly, and make sure that you know what those things are, all right? Here are some of the things that you may find on the test. Of course, we talked about the need for the fundamentals, and we talked about a lot of the different false doctrines that were happening in the 1800s. We mentioned higher and lower criticism, which was made popular by a man named Julius Wellhausen. We mentioned the Mormon religion, started by Joseph Smith. We mentioned the word that I have a very difficult time saying, existentialism, all right, or Alex Cullen can tell you about that, and that was made by Friedrich Nietzsche. Then we had the theory of evolution, given to us by Charles Darwin. Progressive education, the founder there was John Dewey. Seventh-day Adventism, all right, founded by Ellen G. White. Jehovah's Witness, Charles Taze Russell. Christian Science, by Mary Baker Eddy. And then unity, of course, our little memory theme there. Unity, all right, 2 different people, Charles and Myrtle Fillmore. Modern psychology, Sigmund Freud. And the charismatic movement, Charles Parham. All right, we talked about the fact that the fundamentals were organized by R.A. Torrey and A.C. Dixon, R.A. Torrey being the main person there. Then we talked about higher criticism. We mentioned that higher criticism has a faulty basis. It is based on subjective conclusions, German fancies, and anti-supernatural teaching. And we mentioned all 3 of those. Then we mentioned several big names in the higher critical movement. Of course, one that we would want to know is Spinoza, all right, who is known as the originator of the higher critical idea. And then we don't want to get him confused with Eckhorn, who is sometimes called the father of higher criticism, all right? And mainly because he was the first one to use the term. We also mentioned Mr. Graff, all right, from the Graff-Wellhausen theory, all right, advocated the idea of the Jehovistic, Elohistic documents written hundreds of years after Moses. We also mentioned Mr. Wellhausen, the other part of the Graff-Wellhausen theory, all right, that published the book History of Israel, and really caused a lot of Bible scholars to change the time frame in which they looked at some of the things that happened in the Bible. We mentioned the JEDP theory, and of course we want to know what those words stand for. J stands for Jehovistic or Yahwistic, all right? E stands for Elohistic, and then D stands for Deuteronomist, and then P stands for the priestly code. And we mentioned, of course, that idea is that basically the Mosaic books, the first 5 books of the Bible, were written quite a bit, hundreds and hundreds of years later. Of course, we mentioned several different things that the higher critics think. We mentioned the book of Isaiah, in which higher critics think that the first 39 to 40 chapters of the Bible were written by Isaiah, but then the second part of Isaiah, chapters 40 through 66, all right, were written by Deutero-Isaiah, second Isaiah. Of course, we don't believe that is true, but that is what they teach. We mentioned the different names of God, and of course, JE stands for Jehovistic, Elohistic, And we mentioned the fact that these names of God are different things relating to him. Of course, we mentioned Jehovah is the personal name of God, and of course, Elohim is his title. Kind of like we'd say President Trump, all right, Trump being his personal name, President being the title. All right, Jehovah is the personal name of God, and Elohim is his title. We mentioned several of things that people try to say, higher critics try to say about the first 5 books of the Bible, is they try to say that Moses couldn't have written them because he didn't know how to write. And of course, we mentioned there's some archaeological evidence that disprove the idea that people could not write back then. We've got the Code of Hammurabi, which was written quite a bit before the time of Moses, and that is one of the archaeological proofs that deal with the fact that writing was around. We mentioned that higher criticism as a definition is the discovery and verifications of facts regarding the origin, form, and value of literary productions upon the basis of their internal characters. And that was the definition we gave of higher criticism. We mentioned the idea of the book of Deuteronomy. Of course, the Deuterist part of that we mentioned that higher critics believe that it was invented around the time of King Josiah, during the time in which they found the Bible in the temple. And for the higher critics, they say that's when the book of Deuteronomy was actually written. And it was written as a forgery. Of course, we know that's not true because Jesus quoted out of the book of Deuteronomy several times, including 3 times during the time in which he was tempted of the devil. And would Jesus really quote a book based on a forgery? And I don't think so, all right? We mentioned the fact that the idea that the books of Moses, especially the book of Leviticus and the priestly code, written hundreds and hundreds of years later, and of course the higher critic would say that the priestly code was put together by the prophets Ezra and Ezekiel. That would make those 2 men to be very deceitful men, because they try to pass it off as it's books of Moses, when in fact they were the ones that wrote it. All right, of course, we don't believe that at all. We mentioned several different archaeological things. Of course, we mentioned stuff dealing with Belshazzar, and of course, we talked about the Nabonidus cylinder and the Nabonidus chronicle. We mentioned the different flood legends, of course, over 270 flood legends, with the Toltec Indian flood legend being one of the most amazing, dealing with not only the flood but the Tower of Babel. And we mentioned, of course, several different archaeological things. We mentioned the historical figure Amraphel out of Genesis chapter 14 being Hammurabi. Then we had an entire lecture, or actually probably 2 lectures, dealing with prophecy. And we mentioned several very important prophecies found in the Bible. And of course, you definitely want to know these different references in relation to these prophecies. Of course, we mentioned Genesis 3:15, the very first prophecy in the Bible, a prophecy of the virgin birth of Jesus Christ. Isaiah 7:14, the prophecy that his mother would be a virgin, and that Emmanuel would be born, which means God with us. We mentioned the prophecy found in Isaiah 9:6, which include the many names of Jesus, including Mighty God and Everlasting Father. We mentioned the prophecies found in Isaiah 53, which told that Jesus would die for his nation. We mentioned Psalm 22, which is an amazing prophecy about the death of Jesus Christ on the cross. And we mentioned, of course, the fact that Psalm 22 tells us the thoughts that Jesus had on the cross. A very amazing psalm. Then we mentioned Isaiah 44:28 and 45:1, which was a prophecy of Cyrus, king of Persia, who would allow Israel to go back into the land and rebuild their temple. Of course, predicted 200 years before that happened. We mentioned Deuteronomy 28, which has a possibility of a prophecy of the nation of Rome. And then we mentioned the amazing prophecy found in Ezekiel chapter 26 through chapter 28, the fall of Tyre, or Tyrus, all right? And we mentioned that was an amazing prophecy in the way that it unfolded. Of course, the prophecy started with multiple nations attacking Tyrus, but Nebuchadnezzar conquering the old city of Tyrus. Unfortunately, he couldn't get all of Tyrus because the island, many of the people had fled out to the island and built another city of Tyrus out on the island. Is it true that he defeated Tyrus? He absolutely did. He destroyed the old city of Tyrus, but he couldn't get to the new city of Tyrus. And of course, we mentioned that several hundred years later, Alexander the Great completed that prophecy by taking a navy out, building a causeway out to the island of Tyrus and destroying Tyrus. And so, is it true Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Tyrus? Yes. Is it true that Alexander the Great destroyed Tyrus? Absolutely as well. All right. We mentioned several other things dealing with parts of the Bible. From our reading, we mentioned Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2. Of course, we mentioned Genesis chapter 1 was the story of creation, and Genesis chapter 2 dealt with the creation of the Garden of Eden. No contradiction there, of course. And then we talked about, and we've spent quite a bit of time on the certainty of the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. And we've got several things that we dealt with there, all right? Of course, we mentioned the doctrine of the resurrection, mentioned 104 times at least in the New Testament. We mentioned that the apostles felt it was a very important doctrine, in fact, a very foundational doctrine. It was the main point of Peter's message at Pentecost. We mentioned the fact that the crucifixion loses its meaning without the resurrection. What's the point of Jesus dying on the cross if he didn't raise from the dead? He'd just be a martyr, all right, if he didn't resurrect from the dead. We mentioned the fact of several proofs of how we know that the Gospels, and especially the Gospel account of the resurrection, were independent eyewitness accounts. And we mentioned several things. We mentioned, first of all, that there are too many supposed discrepancies for them to have been made by collusion. Obviously, if people were colluding together, they wouldn't write something that had so many things that looked like they contradicted. Now, of course, we know there are no contradictions in the Bible, but there are definitely some things that look like contradictions. And if the apostles or the four gospel writers were colluding, they would not have written it that way. We also mentioned the fact that it was there's too much harmony in the Gospels for them to be done separately. And so we see that the only other possibility is simply an eyewitness account. It's obvious that these people gave an eyewitness account. And we said several reasons why. Of course, we mentioned the fact that their testimony was very straightforward and very simple. There was no evidence that they sat and thought about the things that they were saying. They were giving their testimony just the way that they were supposed to give it, all right? There was no attempt to color the story, to try to make it work with everybody else. There was nothing like that. They gave just plain old facts, and some facts that they gave didn't seem to jive with other eyewitness accounts until the third eyewitness comes and provides information that corresponds with, brings the two together. We mentioned several things that the writers would not have written if, in fact, they were trying to write something that they wanted people to believe. All right, they would not have written that women were the first one to discover Jesus. Of course, women weren't highly regarded during that time. They definitely would have said that Jesus appeared to his enemies, because after all, if you're trying to get him to believe the resurrection, his enemies saying they saw him would make great proof. And yet, there's no record of Jesus appearing to any of his enemies. We mentioned the fact that Jesus' appearance after the resurrection were occasional. He didn't live with his disciples for 40 days after he resurrected. He appeared and disappeared for the next 40 days, but wasn't completely with them the entire time. Of course, we mentioned the fact that it's not explained why Jesus said to Mary, "Don't touch me." And it's not explained later on when the other women meet him, where they are allowed to touch him and grab him by the feet. We mentioned that. Of course, we mentioned little facts that they mentioned, like the fact that John outran Peter to the tomb. All right. We mentioned the fact that Mary, when she saw Jesus, she didn't recognize him until he said her name, Mary. And then she recognized him. Of course, the two disciples walking on the road to Emmaus didn't recognize Jesus either until he broke the bread and prayed. And at that prayer, they recognized who he was. There's no explanation why they didn't understand or recognize who it was. We mentioned, of course, little details that were mentioned. For instance, we mentioned the fact that when the women were told to go tell the disciples, the angel specifically said, make sure you tell Peter. Of course, Peter was the one that denied him. We mentioned when Jesus does finally appear to some of the disciples as they're out fishing, we mentioned that Jesus has an interchange with Peter in which Jesus asks Peter 3 times, lovest thou me? And Peter answers 3 times, yea, Lord, thou knowest that I love thee. And we mentioned the interesting interchange in the fact that the 3rd time, it says that Peter was grieved when Jesus asked him, lovest thou me? And we mentioned the fact that there was a little interplay there with the Greek words. 2 times Jesus used the word agape, but on the 3rd time, Jesus changed from the word agape to phileo. And of course, that was the word that Peter had been using the whole time. He says, Lord, I'm not going to use the word agape. You know that I love you, but I phileo love you. And the 3rd time when Jesus changed words, it grieved Peter's heart. We mentioned the little fact that when Peter and John went to the tomb, it mentions the fact that John saw the linen clothes lie, and he believed. We mentioned, of course, the fact that what we believe he saw was the empty cocoon, in a sense, in which Jesus' body was. The grave clothes weren't unwrapped at all. It is as though Jesus' body just went right through the grave clothes, and they just kind of collapsed inward. We mentioned, of course, the napkin laying by itself was a picture that the master would return. Of course, a picture of Jesus returning someday. We mentioned the apostles upon the resurrection began preaching it as a foundational truth in what they believe. And just the fact that the apostles began preaching that's amazing. If you remember right, what were they like before the resurrection? They were scared. They were concerned. They were not looking for the resurrection. But after the resurrection, after they saw him, they boldly preached in Jerusalem the many things about the resurrection. It completely changed how the disciples were. They were not scared anymore. And we mentioned, of course, the fact that men never believe a doctrine, or they never die for a doctrine in which they don't firmly believe. And all of the disciples, except for one, died a martyr's death, preaching the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We mentioned the fact that there were several different lies that were given about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And we mentioned 5 different theories that people have done or ways they tried to explain away the resurrection. Of course, the oldest of these is the theft lie, which is what was mentioned in the Bible. And that, of course, was the fact that the disciples stole the body of Jesus. And we mentioned that was pretty crazy for several things. First of all, if the guards were sleeping, how would they know that that the disciples stole anything? Obviously, it wouldn't. We said sleeping sentries make poor eyewitnesses. Of course, if the disciples stole the body, they would have known they stole the body. Why would you die for something that was a lie? All right. We mentioned several things, several changes as well about the apostles. Of course, we already mentioned the fact that they were more bold. We also mentioned the fact that the day of worship seemed to change from the Sabbath day, a Jewish holiday, all right, to a Sunday, which was the first day of the week. Why Sunday? It was the resurrection. We also mentioned the fact that there was the disciples didn't do sacrifices anymore. There was really a moral transformation dealing with the disciples. Other theories that we mentioned, of course, were the swoon theory. And that's the idea that Jesus didn't die at all, that he was just resuscitated in the tomb. And of course, we mentioned several crazy things about the swoon theory. is, first of all, he had severe damage done to him during the crucifixion. Is it possible that a guy could survive with no medical attention in a cold, dank tomb for 3 days? All right, and to walk out? Of course, would he, in his medical state, be able to fight off guards or sneak away from guards? Would he be able to move a stone that several women could not move? We know there were at least 4 women that went to the tomb, and they were concerned about being able to move the stone. Could Jesus walk for so many miles on nail-pierced feet? If he arrived at his disciples, he would have been a physical wreck, and the disciples wouldn't have been, excited about going around preaching the fact that he resurrected. They probably would have been very sympathetic of him. And by the way, he would have obviously been a fraud, and they would have known that. By the way, there is no other reference of when and where Jesus died, and so that makes the swoon theory not very good. All right, we mentioned the wrong tomb theory, and that's the idea that the women just went to the wrong tomb. Of course, we mentioned that's crazy because Mary Magdalene and the other Mary actually saw where they buried him, so they had been there before. She was the last person at the tomb when they buried him, and of course, she was the first person back at the tomb. We mentioned the fact that Joseph and Nicodemus were the ones that put him in the tomb, and Joseph owned the tomb. So if they claimed that Jesus resurrected, Joseph would know where his own tomb was. Definitely the priests and the soldiers knew where the tomb was. If they went to the wrong tomb, was another tomb being guarded by soldiers? Why was that tomb empty? Wouldn't the priests have just gone to the right tomb and opened it up and said, here's the body of Christ? We mentioned that. Of course, we mentioned the goofy idea of the twin theory. That one, there's just no evidence that Jesus had a twin. And really, could a twin who never knew Jesus until he showed up in Jerusalem really have been able to fool the disciples that had been lived with Jesus for 3 years? Would he have been able to fool Jesus' own mother, Mary, the mother of Jesus? Of course not. Then we mentioned the fifth one, the hallucination theory, and that's the idea that they were all hallucinating. Of course, that's goofy. 500 people having the same hallucination doesn't make any sense at all right? We talked about several different things about, of course, the crucifixion and trial of Jesus. We mentioned, of course, some of the things that are seem like they're contradictions. Of course, they're not. We mentioned, of course, the cock crowing, and Mark says the cock crowed twice before Peter denied Jesus thrice. Of course, the other Gospels say that the cock would not crow until Peter had denied thrice. We mentioned, of course, those other Gospels are talking about the idea of the cock crowing, all right, as in a time frame. Whereas Mark actually mentions how many times the bird actually made sound. And the bird made 2 sounds before Peter denied Jesus 3 times. Of course, we mentioned the different high priests. Jesus actually had multiple trials all through the night. Of course, we know he was tried first by Annas, the father-in-law of the high priest, the old high priest. He was also tried by Caiaphas, the official high priest. He was later sent to Pilate early in the morning, and Pilate sent him to Herod. And so Jesus had 4 different trials. Of course, they were illegitimate trials. We mentioned the drink. Of course, we mentioned the fact that he was given a concoction basically of wine and myrrh and vinegar, kind of a mixture drink there. Of course, we mentioned the sign on the cross. 2 parts to that sign. There was his title and his accusation. And so there's no error there with that. Of course, we mentioned the time frame and the different ideas about maybe how they told time or the thought there. Of course, we mentioned the order of events in which the resurrection took place, and we went into quite thorough detail about that. We mentioned, of course, first of all, that it was Mary Magdalene that came by herself at night while it was still dark. She came, she saw the stone rolled away. She hadn't seen angels. She hadn't seen Jesus. She doesn't even go in the tomb. She runs immediately to Peter and John and tell them they've taken away the body. Peter and John, of course, run to the tomb, and Peter runs in there first, of course. John beats him to the tomb, but then Peter goes into the tomb first, sees no angels, sees no Jesus, They just see the grave clothes lying there. Of course, John believes, but Peter walks away. They both go back home. Mary Magdalene, of course, stays at the tomb, weeping. And she finally goes inside the tomb. And it's there where she meets a couple of angels that ask her why she's weeping. Then she hears Jesus talking. She supposes him to be the gardener. And she offers to carry the body of Jesus back to the tomb if the gardener would just tell her where he put him. Of course, that gardener was not a gardener, but it was Jesus. And when he said her name, she recognized who he was. He tells Mary then to go and tell the disciples. Once again, this would be the second time that she's gone to tell some of the disciples. Apparently, at that point in time, the Gospels don't tell us exactly when, the other women come on the scene. They must have come on the scene as Mary was either leaving the tomb or on her way out, all right? And they arrive. Of course, they meet angels. They don't see Jesus, but they do see the angels at the tomb. The angels tell them, go tell the disciples. All the women run to see the disciples and tell the disciples. Of course, when Mary Magdalene saw Jesus by herself, Jesus, of course, said, don't touch me. But on the way to see the disciples, Jesus did allow all the women to touch him as they grabbed him by the feet and worshiped him. We mentioned they do go tell the disciples, we have seen angels, we've seen Jesus, and then Peter decides to run back to see if he could see Jesus or see angels. He does go back to the tomb all by himself. And of course, we mentioned it does seem that he probably saw Jesus, or at least saw him afar off, because later on, of course, we see that he is accused of by the two on the road to Emmaus that he had seen Jesus. All right. Of course, after Peter leaves and goes back home, Jesus does appear to those two on the road to Emmaus. They recognize Jesus when he breaks bread and prays, and they go back and tell the other disciples. While they are kind of doubting those things, Jesus appears to the 10 disciples and, of course, upbraids them for not believing. A week later, he does appear to all 11 disciples because Thomas wasn't there, and doubting Thomas finally believed, all right? And so we saw that. I think that is a good review there for this test. And I believe I've captured just about everything that you need to know. And so I definitely study everything. And once again, just look over all your notes just in case I missed something. But I hope you do well on this midterm.